The Maine sea wind howled, and the sound of rusted steel creaked beneath the hull of a decayed ship. Under the mocking stares of neighbors, Isabel Moore paid exactly $900 to tow it home, just scrap metal. The young woman, a mechanic left behind in a dying town, saw something mysterious in the corroded hulk. Then an old sailor walked into her workshop, handing her a sealed letter that had remained unopened for 80 years, marked, "To the one who finds Harbor Angel, Normandy, 1944." And the secret within would forever change her life and an entire community. The coastal town of Maine had once been bustling, but now only shadows of old boat sheds, peeling wooden docks, and shuttered shops remained. Fishermen had abandoned the sea as the fish disappeared, and shipyards had closed as no one could afford repairs. The young had moved away, leaving behind windswept streets and a few taverns surviving on memory. In that decay, Isabel Moore held on. The family's small shipyard, once her father's pride, was now stained with oil and rust. Its tin roof leaking, its yellow light flickering weakly. But for Isabel, every crack in the concrete, every rusted wrench still carried her father's breath. She remembered vividly that storm when she was 10, winds ripping the doors open, seawater flooding the deck, her father thrusting a wrench into her hand. "You keep this pump running, I'll keep the ship standing." That night, amidst the howling wind and crashing water, little Isabel's trembling hands tightened each bolt. Sweat and rain mixing. From then on, she didn't just learn a trade, she understood what keeping life going with her hands meant. Years later, after her father passed, she chose to stay to keep the yard alive. Friends called it foolishness. They left for city jobs, while Isabel bent her head under the cold roof, surviving on odd repair orders. She heard all the sneers, a girl like that rolling in grease, who'd ever marry her. But Isabel never left. One autumn morning, a port broker came by. He tossed a slip of paper onto her desk. "There's a WWII hospital ship, completely rotted, $900 if you want it towed in." Isabel frowned. "If others have abandoned it, why would I take it?" He smirked. "Scrap metal, that's all. But it suits you. Junk belongs with someone who doesn't know when to quit. Think of it as buying a coffin made of steel." The words cut deep but awakened something Isabel couldn't name. That afternoon, a rickety tow truck dragged the ship in. The hull was streaked with rust, its white paint flaking in sheets, the deck cracked wide, the hatch groaning. Townsfolk gathered to watch. One woman shook her head. "That girl's crazy. Better to spend that money on curtains." Teenagers laughed, snapping pictures. Isabel's junkyard grand opening. Isabel heard it all but said nothing. She stepped forward, laying her calloused hand against the freezing steel. The sea wind cut through, sharp with salt and rust. She closed her eyes, imagining her father's voice. "Nothing ever dies completely if you still want it to live." The crowd drifted away. Only Isabel remained silent before the massive hulk, and in that stillness she whispered, "Harbor Angel, I'll make you breathe again." The next morning, Isabel put on coveralls, pulled on gloves, and began clearing the lower deck. Each rotted plank she lifted crumbled to ash. The air reeked of mildew and brine, stinging her eyes. Pulling up a panel near the bulkhead, her hand struck something solid out of place. She pried it loose and dragged out a bundle wrapped in old oilcloth. Inside lay a leather logbook, cracked and yellowed. Isabel opened the first page. Bold handwriting listed dates, coordinates, and the names of wounded transported. Some notes were brief: 14 men, Omaha Beach, or severe wounds, alive. A small photo slipped out. Isabel picked it up and froze. A group of young sailors beamed in front of the Harbor Angel. In the corner, one face stopped her breath, a soldier, smiling eerily like her grandfather's in the family portrait at home. Her hands shook. He had once said he survived Normandy, but never explained how. Could it have been this very ship? The workshop door groaned suddenly. Isabel startled, looking up. An older man shuffled in, stooped, hair white, carrying a worn leather satchel. He froze at the sight of the ship. Lips trembling, "It's her." Isabel stepped closer. "You know this vessel?" He nodded slowly. "Her name is Harbor Angel. I'm Thomas Gallagher. I served on her 1944. His hand shook as he touched the hull, eyes filling. "This ship carried the wounded off Omaha Beach. She pulled us out of hell." Isabel held out the logbook. "I found this." Thomas flipped through the pages, lips tight, eyes dimming. "That's James's handwriting, Captain James O'Connor, my friend." He opened his satchel and drew out a yellowed envelope, sealed with cracked red wax. Faded handwriting scrawled, "To the one who finds Harbor Angel." Thomas placed it in Isabel's hands. "Before our final mission, James wrote this letter. He asked me to keep it, and to give it only to someone who truly brought the ship back to life. I held it for 80 years because I never had the courage to open it. But now I believe it belongs to you." Isabel stared at the envelope, hands trembling. A beam of light through the narrow window glinted off the cracked seal. From the rusted hulk, a wartime legacy stirred alive before her eyes. She swallowed hard, clutching it tight. Minutes ago, this had been a junk ship. Now it was a bridge stretching straight from the Normandy landings of 1944 to her grease-stained hands in Maine. And Isabel understood everything was only just beginning. That night, Isabel sat alone in the workshop. Outside, the sea wind battered the tin roof with shrill groans, the air thick with briny stench. On the wooden table, the wax-sealed envelope rested heavy as memory. She hesitated, then drew a deep breath and cracked the brittle seal. Slanted handwriting appeared and James O'Connor, captain of Harbor Angel, signed it. If you are reading this, then my ship has not vanished. Do not just polish it for shine. Give it a reason to live. Harbor Angel once pulled men off Normandy's beaches. Keep that soul. If you restore her, pass the story on to the generations after. Do not let her sink with us. James. Isabel read each word, her heart aching. It wasn't a farewell, but a charge left for whoever found the ship. She held the letter with both hands, afraid that letting go might dissolve 80 years of memory. The next morning, Isabel continued dismantling the deck. Removing a corroded bulkhead panel, she noticed an odd weld. She tapped hollow, using a wrench and hammer. She worked each rusted bolt free. At last, a cavity appeared, hiding a dark wooden box crusted with dust and salt. She dragged it out, set it on the bench, and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 objects. First, a steel dog tag, letters faint, James O'Connor, U.S. Navy, cold against her fingers. Next, a strip of red bandage, stiff with dried blood. Isabel froze. Her grandfather's voice echoed. He once told her he was wounded at Cherbourg and carried away by a small medical ship. That vague memory now rang chillingly accurate. Could this cloth have once held his blood? Finally, a small notebook. Its pages crammed with names of the wounded, hastily scribbled notes beside many save. Isabel flipped quickly, hands shaking, eyes blurring. Each name wasn't just ink, it was a life once clung to by this ship. She sank onto the cold concrete floor, the notebook in her lap, tears falling onto the yellowed pages. In that moment, Isabel was no longer the mechanic mocked by her town. She held a living legacy, proof of courage, blood, and survival. By evening, Thomas returned. Isabel handed him the box. The older man's hands trembled as he held the dog tag, eyes wet. James once said he'd turn Harbor Angel into a civilian relief ship if he survived. But bombs cut him short. He lifted his gaze to Isabel. Maybe now it's time for you to do what he could not. Isabel turned to the ship. The gray steel glowed faintly in the sunset. Inside her, a flame surged. It was no longer a project to prove herself. It had become a promise to James, the names in the ledger, and her grandfather. After finding the wooden box and Captain James's letter, Isabel knew she couldn't keep the story to herself. One evening, she snapped photos of the logbook, the dog tag, and the blood-stained bandage, then posted them on the town's Facebook group with a short caption. Harbor Angel once saved hundreds of lives at Normandy. I'm restoring her. If your family has any memories or relics connected, please come to the workshop. At first, there were only a few likes and some mocking comments. But the next morning, the workshop door swung open. Dr. Carter, now retired, stepped in carrying a small wooden box. He set it on the table, his voice catching. My father was carried off Omaha Beach on this ship. This is the medical kit he kept. I no longer use it, but maybe it should return to Harbor Angel. Isabel gripped his hand tightly, speechless. That afternoon, a group of high school students stopped by. One boy, Liam, his face still ink-stained from class, scratched his head. Ma'am, can I help? I want to learn the trade. Isabel chuckled and handed him a pair of gloves and a wire brush. All right, start here. The sound of steel scraping echoed in the workshop for the first time. She wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman arrived the next day, trembling as she held a photo. In it, her husband lay on a stretcher. The Harbor Angel's bulkhead in the background. She said, if not for this ship, I would never have married him. Isabel gently hung the photo on the wall right beside James's letter. Even the neighbor who had once mocked Isabel returned. She carried a small wooden box, set it on the table inside. My son died in Europe. I thought your work was pointless, but maybe Harbor Angel carried someone like him back home. Let me help if you'll have me. Isabel simply nodded, eyes brimming. Word spread quickly. A small town meeting was held right in the workshop. People sat on wooden crates and iron chairs, dividing tasks. One group to weld the hull, another to fundraise, another to collect memories. Some shared stories of fathers rescued, others brought postcards hastily written aboard the ship in 1944. The workshop filled with laughter, tears, and the pounding of hammers on steel like a heartbeat revived. Yet difficulties piled up. When dismantling the keel, Isabel discovered severe corrosion that would cost a fortune to replace. She calculated silently her small savings would never be enough. But for the first time, Isabel did not feel despair. Looking around, Liam was working diligently. The widow was cleaning the sick bay, and Dr. Carter was jotting notes for an exhibit. She knew this was no longer her battle alone. Harbor Angel had become the memory station of the entire town. And Isabel understood, this ship no longer merely needed a miracle, it deserved one. One cold morning, Isabel crawled into the engine bay, intending to remove the last corroded plates. When she tapped a beam, the sound was different, hollow, muffled. She frowned, shone her flashlight. Beneath the rust, something had been welded shut. Isabel hauled out her father's old tools, the wrenches darkened by years. She tightened them, each bolt snapping with a sharp crack like breaking bones. At last, the panel gave way, revealing a heavy square object. A small steel safe caked with salt and grease. Her heart pounded. She dragged it up and brushed off the dust. The lock was rusted tight. She pressed her ear close, breathing deep, turning the dial as if listening to a heartbeat. A dry click rang out and the lid sprang open. No gold or jewels, only a stack of papers and a few personal items. Yet Isabel's legs nearly gave way. On top lay James's ledger. Bold handwriting listed fuel costs and spare parts. On the final page, scrawled words for after the war refit Harbor Angel as civilian relief ship, family waiting at home. Isabel touched the line, chest tightening. James had dreamed of turning the ship into a relief vessel, but war had cut him short. Beneath the ledger was a long slip of paper. Isabel pulled it out, $15,000 check, stamped American Red Cross, dated 1944. The shaky note read, for refit after the war. Isabel froze. She had never held such a sum, though she knew the check now held only historical value. But its very existence proved James had not only dreamed, he had prepared. He believed Harbor Angel would one day rise again. At the bottom was a small envelope containing photos, James grinning with his crew, another of the sick bay filled with wounded, and a final shot. James alone on deck, staring straight into the lens as if to say, continue. Isabel collapsed onto the floor, the check trembling in her hand. In her mind, she saw her wounded grandfather, the names in the logbook. James's sealed letter all piecing together into one truth. Harbor Angel was not just a ship, it was an unfinished dream. That evening, Thomas returned. Isabel showed him everything. The older man's hands shook as he held the check, eyes blurring. I remember James once said he'd turn Harbor Angel into a civilian relief ship if he survived, but the bombs cut him short. I forgot, but he did not. The workshop fell silent. Isabel clenched the check, her eyes blazing. Then now we'll finish it. This money may be worthless, but we'll raise the funds with this story, and the ship will live again, not just in steel but in legacy. The shipyard suddenly grew unusually lively. The safe and the Red Cross check became the talk of the town. People no longer called Harbor Angel a pile of scrap, but the ship of an unfinished dream. Isabel spread a large canvas sheet on the table and sketched a design. Not just restoring for looks, we must give it a reason to live, just like James wanted. She drew a white hull with a red stripe, the familiar sign of the Red Cross. Inside, she added a sick bay with folding beds, stretcher slide rails, a corner for medical supplies, and even a small exhibit area for visitors. This ship will be both a memorial and a vessel that can support community rescue. Thomas nodded. Keep the scars of war. Don't paint over everything. Let people see it once stood in fire. But when it came to money, everyone fell silent again. How could a small town possibly shoulder restoration costs in the hundreds of thousands? Liam secretly handed his phone to Isabel. Ma'am, there's a Maritime Heritage Conference coming up in Boston. If you tell the story there, they'll support you. Isabel shook her head immediately. The thought of standing before hundreds made her stomach knot. All these years, she was used to holding a wrench, not a microphone. Old memories flooded back, waves of laughter when she'd been the girl who liked machines in a class full of boys. The taunt, "What do girls know about engines?" still clung to her. Isabel sat alone in the dark workshop that night, looking up at the ship. Her hands trembled as she touched her father's wrench, its wooden handle worn smooth. She remembered his voice in the stormy night, "You keep the pump running, I'll keep the ship standing." Suddenly, she understood her father had given her the strength to hold the whole ship, not just the machine. The next morning, Thomas walked in and found Isabel sitting dazed. He set a hand on her shoulder. James dreamed of Harbor Angel living again for the community. You're the only one who can tell that story. You don't just represent yourself, you represent all of us. Isabel took a deep breath. Her gaze settled on the mottled steel bulkhead. She saw rust. The faces in the sailor's photo, the names in the saved ledger, and her grandfather's shadow. She stood, her voice firm. All right, I'll go to Boston. I'll tell Harbor Angel's story. Thomas smiled and nodded, and for the first time, Isabel felt her fear was no longer a chain but a flame. Launch day arrived. The whole town poured onto the pier, lining the old wooden walkway to the sea. Harbor Angel lay there, a white hull streaked by a red stripe. Patches of steel still bearing rusted scars. Isabel insisted on keeping them as living testimony. The crew had laid and greased oak rails so the hull could slide. Chains were drawn tight and hooked to the winch. Isabel checked every pin, every break. Liam whispered, "I've never felt my heart race like this." Isabel smiled, but her palms were slick with sweat. Thomas stepped up and murmured, "James is watching, trust yourself." The signal horn sounded. They pulled the pins. Harbor Angel began to glide slowly down the rails. The crowd held its breath. Steel scraped and groaned. The waves bobbed, waiting to welcome her. Suddenly, a strong gust swept across the pier, tilting the ship. Worried cries rose up. "She'll tip." The wooden rails trembled. The chains stretched tight like they would snap. Isabel lunged for the brake. Liam threw his weight onto the auxiliary line. Thomas signaled the winchman to ease out slowly. The hull shook, creaking like it was tearing the air apart. Isabel gritted her teeth, hands clamped so hard on the brake that her palms bled. In her head, she heard her father in the storm, "You keep the pump running. I'll keep the ship standing." "No," she yelled, "you will stand." And then, like a miracle, the ship steadied. She slid the last few feet and dropped into the water with a heavy thud. Spray exploded, waves slapped the shore. Harbor Angel rocked hard, then gradually rose, level and firm on the surface. Silence froze the moment. Then a rough voice began from the crowd. "Oh, say, can you see the national anthem?" Others joined in. The song carried across the harbor, blending with wind and waves, wrapping Harbor Angel in the arms of the community. Isabel stood on deck, eyes blurred with tears. She looked at the restored sick bay where James's relics lay in the display case, the dog tag, the red bandage, the saved ledger. It felt as if they were all witnessing this. Thomas climbed aboard with his cane, laying a hand on the rail. "I can hear James, he's smiling." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Liam leapt onto the deck, eyes shining. "We did it, Ms. Isabel." Wiping her tears, Isabel looked out over the open sea. Harbor Angel had returned not just as a ship, but as a witness to memory, the soul of an entire community. And in the roar of celebration, Isabel understood this wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a new journey. Memorial voyage, the first voyage of remembrance. Harbor Angel set out on its first memorial voyage a week after the launch. The sky was clear, the sea breeze gentle, the ripples whispering. Isabel wore her father's old Navy jacket and stood at the bow. Beside her, Thomas gripped the rail, eyes shining like a child's. On deck, families of veterans and townspeople gathered in silence. Each person held a white flower. As the ship moved away from shore, Isabel gave the signal. The flowers were released to the water one by one, drifting into a long white ribbon across the sea. An older man stepped forward, hands trembling, introducing himself as a Normandy veteran. He pointed to an old photo from his pocket. "This is James O'Connor. He pulled me off Omaha Beach. I'm alive today because of him." The crowd fell silent. Isabel choked up, feeling as if James stood there on the deck. From that moment, Harbor Angel was a heritage and a witness to lives still going on. After the voyage, Isabel launched the Harbor of Hope program. The ship opened every weekend, serving as a small museum and a classroom. The local high school taught students about WWII through real artifacts. The logbook, the dog tag, the red bandage, and the Red Cross check. Isabel taught the kids how to weld hull plates, polish steel, and service engines. Learn a trade to feed yourself. Keep memory to feed the community. Other veterans came, some simply stood, a hand on the bulkhead, lips moving as if speaking to an absent friend. Some brought grandchildren, pointing at a photo and whispering, "This is the ship that saved your grandpa." Each time, Isabel felt Harbor Angel carried not only memory, but comfort for wounds not yet closed. News of the ship spread beyond the town. The Red Cross Heritage Program and the State Maritime Heritage Fund sent long-term grants. Visitors arrived and the shops around the harbor grew lively again. The once fading town slowly revived. One evening, with the deck quiet, Isabel sat alone, watching the last white petals drift in the moonlight. The sea breeze brushed her face with its salty taste. She whispered, "James, your dream didn't die. It was waiting for this moment." She smiled, not the smile of someone fighting alone, but of someone who had found meaning. Because Harbor Angel wasn't only saved, it saved a community. And deep down, it saved Isabel too, from loneliness, from the wounds of the past. Opening a future carried forward by legacy.